todos. Muchas gracias por estar aquí con nosotros en una más de las actividades del seminario del área de estudios en arte, ciencia y tecnología. Tenemos el gusto el día de hoy de contar con la participación de un gran artista, un gran colega, una persona que ha sabido conjuntar de una manera tal vez deliciosa la manera en la cual concebimos el trabajo entre arte, ciencia, tecnología y toda la parte de la expresividad. El día de hoy, dado que la presentación es en inglés, vamos a tener una traducción simultánea y por tanto estarán escuchando esta traducción. Entonces, para no quitarle mucho tiempo a Tivon, thank you very much for being here. It's an honor and a pleasure to have you here. And I'm going to read very briefly your bio, and then you will be ready to start, okay? Okay, I'm going to read it in English because it's in English. Tivon Rice is an artist and educator working across visual cultures and technology. Based in the Hagwell and Seattle, his work critically explores representations and communication in the context of digital cultures and asks, how do we see, inhabit, feel, and talk about these new forms of exchange? How do we approach creativity with the digital? What are the poetics, narratives, and visual languages inherent in the new information technologies? And what are the social and environmental impacts of these systems? These questions are explored through projects incorporating a variety of materials, both real and virtual, with recent films, installations, and artificial intelligence-generated narratives. Rice examines the way contemporary digital culture creates images and in turn builds histories around communities and the physical environment. While much of Rice's research focuses on emerging technologies, he continuously reevaluates relationships with sculpture, photography, and cinema. His work then incorporates new media to explore how we see and understand a future thoroughly emerged in the new data visual production systems. Rice holds a PhD in digital art and experimental media from the University of Washington. He was a Fulbright Scholar in Korea 2012, one of the first individuals to collaborate with Google Artist and Machine Intelligence, and is currently an artistic researcher at the Dave University of Technology. His projects have traveled widely with exhibitions in New York, Los Angeles, Seoul, Taipei, Amsterdam, London, Berlin, and Sao Paulo, and he currently is professor at the DXArt at Washington University. Tivon, thank you very much. Welcome, and you have the mic.
Thank you. I will share my screen. Bear with me one moment, please. One moment. Okay, I'm sharing for the first time, so I have to jump through some hoops, but I think this will work. Sorry, Ugo. I am sharing my screen for the first time on this laptop that I'm using, and it's requiring me to restart Zoom to do that. So I will come back in 1 moment, and I will be with you. Okay, let's try this again. Okay, maybe a thumbs up that you're seeing my screen or my slides now. Is this possible? Yeah, okay, great. Sorry for the technical difficulties. This always seems to happen. Hello all, and thank you for the introduction, Ugo. I really appreciate the opportunity to share what I've been working on lately. I am going to describe a few projects, and then I want to talk about making the research that went into those projects available to broader creative communities. That is one of the main goals of my research and teaching. As an overview, for the past 5 or 6 years, I've been working with computer-generated texts like these to accompany my visual and time-based projects. And I would say that my work with machine learning or AI or whatever you want to call it tends to oscillate between working with these systems in my studio in a purely creative mode, and then critically examining how these systems function in society through my teaching, through workshops, conferences, and the like. So in the studio, I assume a position of co-authorship with these virtual voices that can emulate a particular author or poet or philosopher. I can ask them questions. I can have them tell me a story about the future or the past, or I can show them images. And in this case, the system was trained to speak like the science fiction author J.G. Ballard. So using these images of a very particular architecture in the Netherlands as input, the system generates texts that describe the materials, the invisible bodies, and the possible narratives residing within the grounds of the building. This text, as well as the one in the first slide, were also created with a model trained on science fiction, but in this case, it is a hybrid of the authors Ursula Le Guin, Octavia Butler, and others. So as an artist, I think about communing with the spirits of these authors, hallucinating new worlds with their words, and sort of augmenting the points of reference that I've built by reading their stories. So working creatively with these tools helps me understand how language evokes images and sort of narrative decisions within my work. But I also feel that working this way with AI can be a form of creative resistance to its more problematic functions in society. Microsoft's AI is a racist asshole, and elections and economies can be manipulated by fake news generated through the same systems that I'm using in my artwork. The data sets that went into training these systems are extremely biased towards the kinds of language that you would find in the corners of the internet, particularly on Reddit. And this kind of language is being amplified through our daily interactions with machines. Whenever we start to search something on the internet, or we auto-complete a sentence in a particular way in our email. So in my teaching and my artwork is my position that these models should be reformed. They need to go back to school. What if they were trained on data sets chosen by artists rather than corporations? That, again, sort of lays out the creative and critical path that I'm on with these systems. So now I want to take a step back and give a broader background for my work. So I currently live in Seattle, where I teach at the University of Washington's Department of Digital Arts and Experimental Media. This is also where I received my PhD 6 or 7 years ago. And this is where I first met and got to work with Hugo Solis and Annabel Castro, who are both here today. So this is a reunion of sorts. That time meant a lot to me and to the evolution of my work. And it's important to acknowledge that DX Arts, being a PhD arts program at a otherwise large research university, is where I first began to step outside of my more, I'd say, traditional studio arts practice in sculpture and photography, and walk across campus to work with the university's engineering and computer science departments. Before talking about my current projects, I'll say that much of my earlier work explored how these kinds of sort of transmedia installations could incorporate the languages of sculpture, film, and architecture, while looking at the centrality of digital media in contemporary digital culture, visual culture, I should say. So while I'm critically focused on digital culture's impacts upon representation and communication and the places we inhabit. My projects are sort of meant to creatively explore these large, often problematic subjects. Through my projects, I like to draw the audience into conversation on these topics through narrative, immersive spaces, and images that sort of oscillate between real time, the cyclical time of feedback loops, and the sort of frozen time of images from the past. My work recognizes that our natural vision has been profoundly affected by the world of televisual machines that surround us. And while exploring how our perceptions of space and time are impacted by technology, my work specifically addresses ideas of proximity and closeness. How do we feel close to something or somewhere or somebody when communicating through these remote networks of images and data? In real-time installations like these, the idea of presence is very important, but in fact, the opposite is also true. Indeed, the sort of tension between presence and absence is at the core of my installations, where the subject is often in the process of being erased or removed from the image, and the object, which is the system, the video circuit, the hardware, is what remains. So these are the kinds of sensations and questions that I want the audience to discover in my work. How do we experience the counterpoints of presence and absence within new technologies? How do we feel a sense of being here in our current physical space and time versus being there in the virtual space implied by the screen? More recently, I've studied these same questions through the process of photogrammetry, and this process can create virtual 3D models by combining hundreds of regular 2D images. And I enjoy that these projects can begin as a very present sort of camera operation or a very lens-based exercise. The camera and I engaged in this careful sort of photographic scanning of an object, a building or a landscape. But then as that photographic data is processed into a point cloud and a texture and a mesh, a different kind of vision emerges. You know, I'm no longer experiencing single frames or individual viewpoints, but rather a more generalized awareness of the space. I can also make decisions about what to look at or edit or animate in time. And it's interesting to me that this kind of virtual cinematography exists in a different time than that of my physical encounter with the actual space. Over the past 6 or 7 years, I've led a number of workshops exploring this process and its potential relationships with architecture, archaeology, mapping, design, and ecology. And as you can imagine, in some environments, the process can be extended by using drones programmed to cover a large area or an entire landscape. And when thinking about alternative forms of data collection, I've also experimented with using archival material, images from another time, let's say old photos or films of spaces that I've actually never been in. So here we have, you know, on the left, still images from Andrei Tarkovsky's 1983 film Nostalgia, which I used to recreate the ruins of a cathedral that played a very important sort of architectural and psychological role in the film. And in this case, it's possible to build a kind of virtual relationship with images from the past to recreate a space from data rather than pictures from an immediate encounter that I may have had. I'd say that my critical relationship with photogrammetry has mainly focused on urban spaces and preservation, usually in neighborhoods that are undergoing rapid visual, social, and economic change. So these scans can create a kind of temporal archive of an architecture, a neighborhood, or a city. Because of this, much of my work with photogrammetry was focused on my hometown of Seattle, which has changed very rapidly over the past 20 years, in part because of all the technology companies based here, like Amazon and Microsoft and Boeing and Expedia. So these earlier projects were meant to sort of map the visual layer of Seattle's growth. You know, how do we see the city differently through these rapid changes in time? But I was also curious, how do we talk about the city through these changes as well? And I'll explain these better in the following slides, but essentially I've taken my images and trained a computer using a machine learning system to describe what it sees in those images. And these artificial or machine intelligences were trained to speak by analyzing data, specifically thousands of text documents related to city planning and development in Seattle. So I want to share the backstory or the origin of this, but again, I imagine these texts as a way of mapping the language of the city or getting a sense of the different voices used when describing a city's evolving image. So this machine learning dimension of my work is an ongoing collaboration between myself and a research group at Google that was originally established in Seattle and has worked recently with a number of artists. And again, I think the backstory about how AMI, or the Artists to Machine Intelligence Project, came about is very interesting and quite telling about the need for collaboration between different creative communities, in this case, artists and computer scientists. I'm sure everyone's seen these deep dream images that were developed at Google a few years ago. And these are from machine learning systems that train a computer to see things within a particular image and then reinforce them iteratively over time. So if you train a computer to see dogs and then tell it to find anything that remotely resembles a dog's features within a current or within a different image, like a plate of spaghetti, it can hallucinate those features and create new images like these, sort of reinforcing the dogness of an image that may not otherwise have dogs in it. And when these images were first made public, the response was like this: wow, Google made its computer go crazy. Why the neural net project creating wild visions has meaning for art, science, philosophy, and our view of reality. But I would say, you know, within less than a month, as the process became accessible and as recognizable as any, you know, Photoshop filter, Deep Dream was being called out as kitsch, with questions like, is it art? Why does it all look the same? And why are there so many dogs? So in response to this critique, the creative team at Google AMI did something interesting by reaching out to musicians, filmmakers, writers, and, you know, visual artists to ask how they might take advantage of these systems. You know, how can artists use machine intelligence to find something, you know, possibly more meaningful in very large sets of data, be they images, sounds, text, etc. So my ongoing collaboration with AMI involves my recent work with photogrammetry. We saw this photo earlier, but then I asked, you know, Google if we could use machine intelligence systems to learn from large sets of text and generate a kind of poetic response to my pictures. Through this collaboration, this is when I began working with an engineer at Google who had helped develop this project, Neural Storyteller, which uses a recurrent neural network to generate narratives from a given input. And in this case, the input is an image, which the system then describes in a few paragraphs. This system was maybe from maybe 6 or 7 years ago. So it was trained on an older data set, but very importantly, Neural Storyteller could be retrained or biased on different text sets so that its output begins to emulate the voice of a specific author or genre or other large text corpus. This is a very important dimension of my work with these systems. Because at this time, the scenes that I was capturing with photogrammetry tended to be in these urban zones of rapid visual change, in which something is being destroyed or something new is being built in the city, I sort of, again, wanted to explore the language that surrounds this kind of development. I wanted to train neural storyteller to speak based on two very specific bodies of text that I collected from Seattle's Department of Planning and Development. And in doing so, I wanted to see if the tone of those documents could be applied to and have a meaningful relationship with these images. So to begin the sort of process of data collection for this project, I started here. Around Seattle, we have these notices of proposed land use billboards that appear around the city whenever some development is in the works. Something's going to change. And these sort of point the public to where they can learn about or endorse or protest particular developments, either by attending meetings and submitting written comments or by emailing them directly to the city. And all of these data are archived in the public domain here in Seattle. So after collecting about 250,000 files from this website called Shaping Seattle, again, which documents all current and proposed building projects in the city, I organized and cleaned the texts and then trained these two computers to speak, one in the voice of Seattle city planners and one in the voice of public comments or protests to current developments. The public comments are generally texts like these on the left, emails from individuals writing to either endorse or complain about future development. And the city planners' texts tend to be these design guidance recommendations that we see on the right, more technical and practical considerations for the development. Again, in total, I collected about 250,000 of these documents from the city so that the vocabulary and tone of these two data sets could be learned by neural storyteller and thus make it biased towards one voice or the other. The next step of the process runs some image recognition on my photos, which can identify some basic features. So from an image like this, the computer may identify, van, trees, concrete, rocks, graffiti. And once I have these basic captions, the two models are asked to describe these terms in greater detail using language that either emulates the city planners or the public. And, observing this dialogue, I would see that they would sort of get into this uncanny or absurd or sometimes frighteningly accurate back and forth about the scenes they're describing. They talk about property and ownership and design and a lack of parking in the city, displacement. And they even assume sort of the tone of the two data sets. There's maybe a very objective, rigorous tone coming from the city planners and a more confused or emotional or passionate voice coming from the public. So I want to read one of these dialogues. I created a series of maybe 5 or 6 of these, but I'll read one of these dialogues that a computer wrote after looking at my images. The image we see here is a space under the freeway where at the time hundreds of homeless people were living in Seattle. And the computer titled this photograph of an outside place that is exceptionally lovely. The planner. In the broken concrete grounds, the buildings are designed to have a calming effect. Beyond, a temporary park bench provided the exact opposite result. The public. From what I can tell, you do not need to be allowed to leave the grounds of the park. This is a rare treat for the citizens of the shade. The planner. The subject is more personal than usual. The public. I have a more immediate understanding of property. I also have a sudden increase in appearance. The planner. I am absorbing new facts. The public. We are not allowed to move into this section of Earth. In fact, there are a lot of people in the city that have to remain quiet. This view of an open book looking from the bottom of the page towards the sky at a line of flying birds has been designed for several reasons, to create a cloud of color and decay. This is my specialty, and I do not want to waste any more time on Earth. So in showing these scenes to an AI, I wanted to explore how data sort of permeates all layers of society, while often reflecting a different reality than is experienced by individuals or the general public. And sort of looking back on this project, I do feel that if we're receptive to finding strange or remarkable connections in all of this data, different kinds of data, that machine intelligences can tell us something meaningful about large systems, about the places we inhabit, the language we use, and the images we create in these spaces. So this was, I think, one of my first projects after completing the PhD at DxArts, and it was a commissioned work by Google AMI. So I was able to bring it to a number of conferences focused on both the technical and critical and creative discourses surrounding machine learning. Moving forward into my recent work, I still have many questions about sort of human and non-human perception. Like, when perceiving a situation, how do we draw upon our past experiences to understand that situation emotionally or rationally? In our current sort of post-digital lives, how often are those past experiences actually mediated experiences? Like when something we saw on a film or on the internet becomes our primary reference when encountering a situation out in the real world. To what degree can a machine perceive a situation, drawing upon data rather than lived experiences? And can our observation of this machine perception allow us to reflect upon our own understandings of a given situation? So through these questions, I hope to sort of further develop this network of relationships between images, data, and narrative output, while at the same time exploring ideas of intertextuality, automatic writing, language, vision, communing with voices from the past, and sort of navigating the uncanny divide between human and machine cognition. The next project I'll talk about was one of my first after moving to the Netherlands 4 or 5 years ago. It also involves photogrammetry and machine learning, this time including VR as well. And with this project, I wondered what it would be like to collaborate with an artist that I've never met, specifically a dead artist, an author who passed away 10 years ago. So this time, instead of training a computer to speak like city planners, I trained it on the complete works of science fiction author J.G. Ballard. Given 1.5 million of his words, the system tries to emulate his style, his vocabulary, and the sort of narrative tone of his writing. And as many of Ballard's stories deal with architecture, modern catastrophes, isolation, and post-war landscapes, I was compelled at that time to explore these Atlantic wall bunkers that remain along the coast of the Netherlands. So these became the sort of visual landscapes that I showed to Neural Storyteller. So I scanned these buildings with a drone, created these 3D photogrammetric models, and then used the J.G. Ballard sort of text generation system to describe these sort of mysterious landscapes and structures whose meaning has changed much from the time that they were built to their current sort of the image that they represent now. And one way to explain this is that the computer hallucinates Ballard's artistic style while looking at these images. For me, it's like the digital ghost of Ballard is writing a sort of screenplay to accompany my images, a sort of voice from the past describing these historically loaded architectures from the past. And we can watch a quick video of this as if it were from the VR headset. You won't see it in 3D, but it's meant to be viewed inside of a VR headset. Can somebody give me a thumbs up if the sound works for this? This is the first slide with sound.
There was a stark contrast to the grim landscape surrounding them. A vast expanse of concrete in the fading light of the Atlantic Ocean. In that cold grass and stone, the debris seemed to echo a knowledge that turned all around them. In the distance, dozens of birds filled the air. There was a flash of white feathers, like a startling memory in the sky above.
We'll look at some more examples from more recent films shortly, but there are 3 of these VR films, each of them about 5 or 6 minutes long, that continue to develop this sort of descriptive narrative voice. And around this time, I also trained a number of other models on authors that I believe have a sort of thematic resonance between their work and this idea of embedding a voice or a personality within an artificial intelligence. So Philip K. Dick, William Burroughs, Ursula Le Guin, Octavia Butler, and Italo Calvino. I think a very important idea that I want to add is that my artwork and my research and my teaching all explore how to build critical and almost collaborative relationships with these technologies. So it is important to be honest and say that I do step in and give the final form to these texts. And this decision to edit or gently reorganize the output from the machine learning system is my response to the questions surrounding the artistic agency of machines. For example, should we initiate these systems and then step back and take whatever they create to be the final sort of raw output to sort of demonstrate the technology? Or are there moments where we can reinsert ourselves into the process and make decisions about how the output resonates with our own poetics? So I take a very particular position on this topic, and in cultivating this collaborative relationship with AI, what I'm beginning to find is that as I observe a machine learning system develop some kind of understanding about language, that my own understanding of language begins to shift as well. I can start to see from a sort of third-person perspective how language evokes images and narrative decisions in my work. And personally, given my past work's concern with presence and absence, it's compelling to me that I'm working with a virtual sort of non-human agent working within these technologies that we're just beginning to build creative relationships with. So the sort of tension between presence and absence remains a central theme in my work with AI as I pose the following questions here. Where does the artist reside within a work that is partially created by machines? How is authorship or creative agency built into semi-autonomous systems? Working with AI, when can artists remove themselves from a process and allow the system to work independently? And finally, when is it important for artists to reinsert themselves into the creative loop? The next project I'll talk about was commissioned for a festival in The Hague in the Netherlands. And this film, called Environment Built for Absence, is an unofficial, artificial sequel to J.G. Ballard's 1975 novel, High Rise. And the idea to make one last artwork with this J.G. Ballard version of Neural Storyteller came when the demolition of the former Dutch Statistics Bureau building began in early 2018. And this was a really strange scene because it was right along the edge of the railroad. So anybody traveling from The Hague to the airports or Amsterdam got to observe this very slow kind of cinema, this sort of observable erosion of this building that took over a year to take down. The next time you were on the train, the image would be slightly, almost imperceptibly different as this concrete building slowly dissolved into the ground. And there was this sort of like cinematic nature of a windowed frame in the train car moving past the scene, which made me think that that is a very J.G. Ballard sort of scene. This is like the aftermath of his novel High Rise. So similar to the previous projects, I flew a drone over the site almost every month over the course of the demolition in 2018 and created this sort of archive of 3D scans. And these were, of course, the images that I showed to Neural Storyteller. And in the resulting video, we hear an AI that sort of speaks again in a voice from the past, about the sort of ghosts hiding within the cracks of urban spaces. I'll show the trailer for this film. Also, the full 18-minute film is available to view on my my website or Vimeo. So let's take a look.
Environment Built for Absence. An unofficial, artificial sequel to J.G. Ballard's High Rise. A full view of a place with a glass frame. Signs on the street describe where things are. Shops along the street with witty names and nice landscaping. A mechanical bird in a cage. The mechanical bird grasps to the cage and is reflected in a mirror. And I am now surrounded by pale blue sky with a silver volume suspended in the air. It is a glass building near a freeway exit. A see-through building with a collection of machines inside. How many times have I been here? On the other side of the building, images of the city filled an otherwise empty courtyard. Paintings of freeways and vacant parking lots. A long exposure photograph of an old street. Large black canvases hanging in broken frames. How many times have I been here?
Okay, so this project debuted in 2018 in The Hague's New Regentes Theater, which was strange because it was the remains of an old swimming pool from the 1920s. But I was quite happy with this venue because the image of an empty swimming pool is actually a recurring image in many of J.G. Ballard's novels. And in High Rise, specifically, the pool becomes this strange architectural meeting space between the different social groups within the building. So there was some architectural resonance between the video and the exhibition space. It also showed in London a couple years ago in an old concrete Victorian factory. So I like working in these physical spaces that have some sort of a material resonance with the decay of the building in the video. The video and the text kind of live in this kind of virtual space, and I like to bring those stories into concrete, literally concrete physical spaces. Yeah. I also wrote more about this project for the Strelka Institute of Media, Architecture and Design based in Moscow. And this can be found on their online platform called New Urban Conditions. So writing this was a good opportunity to reflect on the kind of digital storytelling that I've been developing over the past 5 years, specifically around urban spaces. How do we see, talk about, and imagine the city through the lenses of digital media? How are immediate physical experiences of architecture, landscape, and the environment affected by less tangible, increasingly virtual experiences? Moving on to the next project gives me an opportunity to reflect on the time that I was in the Netherlands. I was there for about 3 years total, but I can see how I went there with a clear focus on urbanism. But as I presented my recent projects at exhibitions and conferences and workshops, I found that many of the conversations that arose asked how could we apply these ways of seeing and understanding large systems to the topic of the environment instead. And I think that these questions are, of course, a product of the times, but I also came to understand how the Dutch landscape, which may be one of the most highly engineered landscapes in the world, also provokes this kind of critical attention about the environment. So I was asked to participate in a number of projects that sought to apply emerging forms of image production, mapping, world building, and storytelling to the topic of the environment. Either very specific environments like the islands on the north coast of the Netherlands, or more broadly, how can we begin to imagine ecology and the environment from new perspectives, possibly even non-human centered perspectives. So this recent project, Models for Environmental Literacy, brings together these 3 areas of research. 1, field trips and workshops in which groups of artists, ecologists, authors, and musicians sort of visit these sites at the boundaries of human involvement and environmental change. The second sphere of work is research into natural language processing, both to move beyond my previous work with Neural Storyteller and while updating the system to see how it can be made more accessible to wider creative communities like those participating in my workshops. And the third sort of task for this project was to develop a series of films that creatively reflect on the research as a whole, that sort of combine digital images and virtual environments with narratives generated through this updated natural language processing system. We already saw the field work from the past few years. So regarding the AI and natural language processing, for the past 2 or 3 years, I've been working with the GPT-2 language model developed by OpenAI. And I've been interested in how this model was partially made public, but that the large-scale version was restricted for a while, and it was considered the language model that's too dangerous for the internet because of its potential misuse for generating fake news. But like I said earlier, I've also been focused on understanding how these models can be fine-tuned or retrained for creative projects like ours. Not just for my projects, but for wider creative communities that may not have resources capable of using these tools. So this was a collaboration with the Technical University of Delft. This research was also supported by Google AMI, as well as the Netherlands Creative Industries Fund. And I was technically focused on how GPT-2 could be retrained with custom data sets, even if the user doesn't have a background in coding or a $5,000 GPU to do the training. And I'm happy that at a couple of these recent workshops that I've conducted, we've been able to do just this over the course of 2 or 3 days, allow the participants to focus on collecting texts, building a relationship with their data, and then sharing the tools to fine-tune GPT-2 and ultimately generate new texts to provoke ideas in their artwork, to provoke ideas in their writing or their poetry, or just generally their thinking on the environment. So I want to return to this topic of workshops at the end of my talk, because I think this topic of knowledge sharing is super important. Returning to my work, ultimately I was able to fine-tune some new language models of my own, and these are the voices for my latest film. So instead of using the artificial voice of J.G. Ballard, I've trained a number of different ecologically concerned AIs. One trained on eco-philosophy, one on eco-fiction, and one on very recent scientific reports about the current environmental crisis. I'm keeping an eye on the time here, and I have a lot of notes about this project, but I think it might be most useful to look at the trailer as well to get a sense of these voices, to see the sort of scenes that they're describing. So I'm going to skip over a few kind of technical notes really quick.
We are fine with that, Tivan. I mean, unless you
Is that
are
okay? Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Hugo. I will stick with it then. I'll stick it out. So this film brings me up to my last year of studio work and exhibitions. Although the lockdown in Europe, as I was moving back here, meant that there were a lot of canceled and postponed events. But that gave me a lot of time to sort of work with these 3 language models and generate the script for the films. These scripts are a bit different than my previous films, in which an image is the starting point for the dialogue. In these 3 films, the relationship between the 3 models provides the sort of narrative structure. The first film I authored is called Circular Conversations, and the logic of the dialogue is circular. One model is asked the question, a very simple question, tell me what you see. And its response or its output becomes the prompt or input for the next model. In this dialogue, the entire paragraph from the scientist becomes the prompt for the philosopher. And then the philosopher's output is the prompt for the author, and so on. So this text that we see on the right is just one output from the system. And each film is about 4 or 5 pages in total, or about 10 minutes each. The first film is visually focused on this strange Dutch island called the IJsselhoog. And this perfectly circular man-made island was designed to sort of isolate the toxic sediment generated during the engineering of the farmlands in the north of the Netherlands. So the film's animation sort of studies the uncanny circular landscape and surrounding water in black and white. The second chapter is called Whisper Poems, and the logic of this dialogue is also circular, but in this case, only 2 or 3 words from the previous output is considered for the following input. So like a whisper poem or a game of telephone, there's some continuity, but there's also a greater chance of misunderstanding between the different models as the story evolves. This chapter is visually focused on the islands surrounding Helsinki in the northern Baltic Sea. And this is a strange situation as well. The Baltic Sea is rising at 1.5 millimeters per year, but these islands are also rising at 3 millimeters per year as a result of post-glacial rebound. So it's strange, these small bits of land present a sort of paradoxical image in terms of our human timeframes, how we can perceive the landscape. So this film's animation sort of studies the isolation and almost invisibility of a number of these small rocky islands and the surrounding waters. The third chapter of the film is called Echo Chambers, and the logic of this dialogue is a feedback loop in which one model's output becomes its own input over and over again. Thus, each character has a much longer monologue without being in dialogue with the other voices. And in this chapter, each text is prompted by, again, a very simple question: where are we? This final chapter is visually focused on these toxic algae growths in Zeeland. This is in the southwest of the Netherlands. And these blooms are caused by excessive chemical use in agriculture, the over-engineering of the Netherlands Delta after a flood in 1953. So this film's animation sort of studies the strange color and dense textures of the algae surrounding a number of islands in this estuary, which is essentially a dead sea. So again, I have a trailer for this. It's about 4 minutes long. The full duration of the film is about 36 minutes long, but I think the trailer gives a sense of the different voices. So let's watch this.
Models for environmental literacy.
What is an island? Is it a graveyard? In what sense is it an island? Does an island denote a sense of spatial absence?
I'm afraid of the absence. It seems to be forming on me. Its dark forms disturb me. The whole place silent. The stones are a blur.
All of this anxiety and worry goes hand in hand with an ongoing process of change. A change that, although not explicitly recognized by this program, has become obvious to all.
This, for me, is the essential paradox of our stories. In finding our way within the world, we humans invent or modify or redefine reality in ever larger and more incomprehensible ways. So our words are not only a vehicle for revealing the world to the reader, but also a vehicle for revealing the reader. Tell me what you see.
I see here a map, number 3.21, showing the changes in physical characteristics of European ecosystems as caused by climate change.
In order to survive in the new environment, the recognition of these changes will be the first milestone on the road to the realization of the other. Let us sing.
Does othering the other also mean separating care for nature from a commitment to promoting other forms of environmentality? Are care for nature and greed two sides of the same cracked coin?
But this splitting of roles is only one means by which people control the other. It's murky, isn't it? All sorts of things happening at once, everywhere at once. A pigeon can smell a rat from 2,000 feet.
We are now living through the Anthropocene, the point at which human activities can be reliably labeled as contributing to the rise in global average temperature. A rat crawls on all fours because it needs stability.
So it must be our objective to make society eclectically organized. Sensu eclectica, as they called it, so that we may preserve the capacity for action, for initiative, for creativity. Tell me what you see? Actually, I don't know what it is.
Where are we? How did this happen? What will we miss the most? These are questions that define how we think about and experience the world. But they are also core questions when thinking about disaster and adaptation.
Where are we? What are we made of? Can we be divided in two? Do we even exist? What do our spatial relations to different living things actually represent? And what is a thing?
Where are we? Let's try to picture the scene. We are at the edge of the forest. At night. It is dream time. There are trees here, but no humans. Overhead, the sky is very dark, a sky of blackness.
So these films debuted last September at a festival in Amsterdam. And over the past year, I've been able to show the film in a number of different contexts. Art exhibitions exploring the intersections of nature and technology, conferences focused on AI and creativity, and like I said, a number of workshops in which I share these tools for working with AI systems like GPT-2 and GPT-3 with artists and authors who generally don't have a prior programming backgrounds. For me, I can say that the research and data collection that I've done over the past couple years, has expanded my understanding of the language surrounding environmental discourse. And again, I believe that sometimes when we're faced with big problems or large systems or situations that are difficult to comprehend, that in a way collaborating with machines like these can help us see the problem from another perspective. I want to save some time to come back to my workshops at the end of my talk, but I'll share one last project that's ongoing. Just this summer, I debuted a project that was commissioned by the New Institute for Architecture, Design, and Digital Culture in Rotterdam, which is a museum as well as the National Archive of Dutch Modern Architecture. And they asked me about a year ago if their archives of architectural interiors, photos of interiors, could be interpreted by the kinds of AI voices that I've been developing over the past few years, I should say. So in the gallery, there's a number of these image and text pairings. There's 50 images from the Institute's archives, each being read by 5 different AIs. So 250 stories in total. And the idea behind the 5 different voices was to recognize that our relationship with interiors has changed drastically over the past 2 years, during lockdown. Our homes have become sites of education, of labor, and remote socialization. And for most, the home became a very different psychological landscape than it was before COVID. So I trained 5 voices, each of them reflecting a data set of about 500,000 words. And they were meant to have this sort of diversity of voice. So these are the 5 sources. The voice of the child is trained on children's novels. The voice of the home was specifically trained on a novel by Georges Perec called Life, a User's Manual, which almost tells a series of stories from the perspective of the architecture. The voice of the other was trained on biology and philosophy that centers non-human perspectives. It's a hybrid of texts by Donna Haraway and Jakob van Uxkol and others. The voice of the space was trained on spatial anthropology and philosophy texts. And finally, the voice of the worker was trained on Marx's Capital, volumes 1, 2, and 3. And again, I'll say again, my motivation for choosing these data sets to train the AIs was to explore a number of sort of voices that may reflect the strange or altered or problematic or sort of absurd relationships we've had with our homes during COVID times. In this project, I went back to this process of using images to prompt the system. So this other software, DenseCap, which is an object recognition system, will analyze the image and return the names and sometimes the context of what it sees in the image. And then those short phrases are sent to the language system so that it sort of completes the picture, writing a fictional short story about what the computer sees inside of the scene. So I'll play back just a couple of these pairings and then point you to the project online as well. This is the voice of the home.
A black and white photo of a building, of a person, of a building being torn down. That is to say, a machine entirely devoid of life, a blank, lifeless, baseless, unchanging, unholy, disruptive, all-encompassing, all-embracing entirety. Just enough to make anyone fall in love with it. A black and white photo.
Again, there are about 250 of these short stories, so I'll just choose a couple. This is one. This is in the voice of the other.
We are in a large white room, with an outdoor scene painted on the wall. Gazing at this scene, I can distinctly remember that the theory of Gaia fascinated me, and that I needed this theory in order to unravel the mystery of the cosmos. I envisioned a chaotic, distracted cosmos in which wonderful things are happening but which is completely out of balance between the inhabitants and the animals. Since Gaia is also a substance, she is also an effector of massive sequential forces, which are responsible for raising and lowering the temperature of the Earth. The cold snaps and the rain are compressed into a prayerful canopy that carries many colors. Like a spider, the leaf grazer of life, Gaia picks up where it leaves. Pigeons, people, beetles, ants, fungi, zebras, a fire, and a highway system full of pathways. Can you imagine the wild? We are.
So I'll wrap up this ongoing, this project by saying that it's ongoing. There is also an online dimension at this website, readinginteriors.etnuinstitute.nl. And this site both describes the project that's in the gallery, but also asks the public to submit their own images to be read by one of the AIs. So every few weeks, I check in on the submissions and write a story for each of the submitted images in the voice of their choosing. And it sort of contributes to this other archive of contemporary spaces. All of the Institute's archive are from modern architecture. They're from 50 to 100 years ago, but we inhabit contemporary spaces. We have built our COVID caves and we've had to set up work and education from home. So I wanted, again, to create these stories about our contemporary spaces as they've been affected over these past couple of years. Okay. I do want to talk more about the workshops, but I also want to wrap up some of the questions that I asked earlier in this talk. I asked a number of questions, first about the divide between human and machine cognition, then about the artist's presence when working with artificial intelligence. But I want to pose another question. I guess I brought this up earlier, thinking about the critical potential of working with AI. We all know that these systems permeate our daily lives. They control how we receive information. They curate the images we see, and even the images that we create. And of course, their effects on politics and global economies are far-reaching. This being the case, what does it mean to work creatively with these machine learning systems? Can a creative act also be a critical act, especially when sort of liberating a technology like AI from its more pervasive political or economic operations? And lastly, what happens when we make these tools available to individuals and communities who are normally excluded from influencing the ways that machines learn from our data, our images, and our language? So these questions lead me to my current research that I want to share in my last few slides. And again, I said earlier that I want to talk more about the workshops that I've conducted over the past few years. So again, over the course of 2 or 3 days, participants will focus on collecting text, building a relationship with their data, and then I share the tools to retrain language models like GPT-2. And participants are ultimately able to generate new texts to provoke ideas in their artwork. For me, it was interesting doing these sessions in the Netherlands, where I found that most of the cultural situations I encountered were actually conducted in English rather than Dutch. Lectures, presentations, and workshops like these tended to include artists from all over Europe, so English seemed to be a kind of default. And this also highlights the problem that GPT-2 is a very English language model. In fact, the whole sphere of natural language processing is highly Anglo-centric. And this is another form of bias that sort of permeates AI. And yeah, you have to acknowledge this. And I, during my last year in the Netherlands, I began researching non-English AI and was ultimately able to help a German and a Dutch artist train very specific models in their own language. I worked with one artist to create a hybrid model of Jewish German and Afro-German poetry. I helped another artist create a Dutch language model that speaks from the perspective of the North Sea. And these projects were sort of a starting point for my thinking about researching a kind of creative resistance to Anglo-centric AI. When I moved back from the Netherlands to Seattle, I had a very similar experience in my teaching. I taught my first DX Arts class in which I introduced similar tools to my students. And I had a Chilean student who wanted to train a model on a number of Chilean texts, the biologist Humberto Maturana, the artist and poet Pedro Lemambel, and also Gaston Sublet, who's a philosopher focusing on indigenous Mapuche culture. But working within the sort of confines of GPT-2, he had to first translate all of these Spanish texts to English, then train the model, then generate outputs, and then retranslate back to Spanish for his resulting artwork. Of course, during this process, much of the poetics and nuance of the source texts were completely lost. So much of my current research is dedicated to supporting the work of 3 Latin American artists and students here at the University of Washington. So the plan is to research Spanish language AI and give these artists a set of tools and funds to develop their work next quarter. And hopefully by the end of this year, have a showcase of their projects using these tools. So it may be helpful to really quickly introduce my cohorts, the students I'll be working with, who I will be engaged in a directed research group next quarter. Esteban Agustin Otero is a sound artist from Valparaiso who's interested in how human and machine interfaces mediate our experience of the physical environment. But growing up in Pinochet's Chile, he's also concerned with censorship, media influence, and surveillance, particularly as it relates to sound and the voice. So for our research, he wants to develop a Spanish language listening device that collects human voices, then generates narratives on the topic of surveillance from what it hears. And Esteban is scheduled to present his work at Insonora, which is a sound and interactive art festival in Madrid this March. And at the festival, he will also lead a workshop to share our research and tools for creating with Spanish language AI. Laura Luna Castillo is a musician and multimedia artist from Puebla, Mexico. And she's interested in the spectrum of personal and collective identities and tends to work at the intersections of cultural poetics, sociology, geography, and ethnography. And Laura plans to work in collaboration with another performer based in Mexico City to create a kind of hybrid identity between herself and her remote collaborator. And so their dialogue will evolve from memories to oral narratives, specifically focused on their conception of home. And Laura states that Spanish language AI would represent a layer of condensation of language and identity, a sort of distilled assemblage of encounters and interpretations, speckled with desire and retellings of things that happened, or will happen, or may not have happened in the space of the home. Laura's research will debut, it's scheduled to debut at an exhibition in Mexico City this March, Dispositivos Visuales, Estructuras para Reimaginar el Mundo. And this is scheduled to show at the Centro Nacional de las Artes. Finally, Nicolas Aguirre is a Peruvian architect and transdisciplinary artist who creates machines that explore and illuminate the social and political nature of sound in public space. Nicolas intends to create a series of disobedient robots in the form of the traditional percussion instruments, the cajon, and he sees these disobedient robots as undermining the functions of mainstream robots, created either to increase industrial productivity or to exert control over individuals and populations, with applications that range from surveillance to robotic weapons. Nicolas intends to give his voice a particularly Peruvian voice by training the Spanish language AI system with Peruvian cultural texts. And he chooses to use Peruvian Spanish in particular, quote, because I expect that part of the training will imprint ways of deforming the European Spanish that has occurred over centuries of imposed Spanish in Peru. In other words, I'm also interested in exploring linguistic disobedience in developing the voice of the cajon disobedient robots. So I'm very happy to work with these three artists. I was first introduced to creative AI in 2016 through my grant with Artists in Machine Intelligence, and that support has meant a lot to my work in the years since. So I'm hoping to, by supporting these individuals' works, that they can build a creative and critical relationship with these systems, that they can create their own models and also share these tools within their communities. So they will get to work next quarter. My part in this research is to conduct research, to conduct my own research to learn what is out there in the world of Spanish language NLP. And I followed a few dead ends from this article, GPT-2 no habla español. After those dead ends, I reached out to my university's Department of Computational Linguistics and actually had a far more positive, a wonderful encounter with their director. And she invited me to one of their monthly meetings where I shared my recent projects, like I just shared with you, that work creatively with AI-generated text. I also shared this current research, Creative Resistance to Anglocentric AI. And I learned that many of their researchers are similarly concerned with non-English models and even modeling endangered languages by working with resources like the Alaskan Native Languages Archive and the Archive of Indigenous Languages in Latin America. So they pointed me in a number of very helpful directions. And just last month, I identified at least 3 different Spanish language models that can very importantly be retrained on custom data sets, such as the texts that my collaborators are currently assembling. This is my last slide. I'm showing this programming interface because I also recognize that hardware and software resources can be another factor that excludes certain communities from working with these tools. So another dimension of my teaching and research is finding open source code and free resources like this online interface that can allow almost anybody to work with AI. You don't need a fancy computer with a GPU. You don't need to necessarily know the Python programming language. You just need to bring a meaningful data set of texts, and this system will both create a new AI model and generate new stories. So, in giving these tools to artists from a diverse set of backgrounds, we can see how they interface with computer-generated text, both from a creative and a critical perspective, whose voices are normally excluded from these large pre-trained models. Where does bias and harmful language reside within these models? And how can we work with communities whose voices and whose data are normally not reflected in these systems? So that's where I'm at in my work and my research. Thank you very much for listening. And I hope we can have a bit of a discussion about the questions you may have.
Wow, Steven. Well, can you hear me?
Yeah, indeed.
Okay, thank you very much for all this detailed presentation. I think it has a very nice evolution of the different kind of projects that you can show. So we can see also the evolution in the thinking, in the use of all these technologies. But I want to open the mic to people that may have questions. We don't have a lot of time because we have about 10 minutes, but it would be pretty nice to hear some questions from you guys. I have a lot of questions, but I prefer to open the mic to people that could have questions. So is there any question around here? Oh, yes, there are some questions. Tivo, how am I going to do this? Oh, is this... Okay, yeah, it's in Spanish and in English. So, are you on the chat? Can you? Okay, well, I'm going to read it.
I can see the question in...
Still, for the people that is on the Zoom, it says, Steven, thank you very much for your talk. Tengo una pregunta. Pensando en nuestros estudiantes de la universidad, ¿podrías hablar un poco de cómo diseñas y cuáles son las etapas que empleas en la realización de tus films ensayos? ¿Qué recomendaciones conceptuales les darías a los y las estudiantes para que realicen sus film ensayos?
Yeah, thank you, Fernando, for the question. I, as an artist working in sort of between different media, I always get the sense that I have a number of different voices in my head. So when we watch films or we read books or we have these references from media culture that maybe affect the way we perceive environments or situations or the world around us. That's always been the case in my artwork. Now working with these strategies for working with AI, it becomes a matter of almost capturing the sources of those voices. What authors do I think about when I encounter a particular scene? And that sort of forces me to really understand my relationship with my references. And so that leads me right into maybe training a new language model. I think about a situation, I think about the voice that I would want to describe that situation in. and I begin to collect the text that goes into training this model. And then it does become a kind of a bit of a collaborative process, I'll say. You know, I'll ask a question of the AI and try to understand its response. That will impact how I ask the next question, or how I start to almost build a kind of dialogue or a position of co-authorship with one of these systems. You know, at points along the way, there's also moments where visual language comes into dialogue with the AI text. You know, of course, I build these sort of virtual worlds that accompany the texts, but it does tend to be this kind of iterative process of co-authorship with text and image.
Sorry, thank you, Tivan. There's another question in Facebook that says, which open source do you employ in your work?
Yeah, I wonder if the question is specifically about this text generation, and I can type some resources in the chat if that helps. But there, I worked with this system called GPT-2 Simple, which I'll put in the chat if that helps you broadcast it to your students. The problem with GPT-2 Simple is that it was pre-trained on an English data set, and so it really can't be reformed away from English. That's a problem, of course. The same author who made GPT-2 Simple open source has just created a new project called AI Text Gen, which is also in the chat now. Both of these can very easily be searched on GitHub. And AI Text Gen can be trained from scratch, so a non-English model can be used. It also points to a very nice resource for natural language processing, which I'll also type in the chat, called, it's a silly name, it's called Hugging Face. That's, I don't know if it's .com, but very easy to search for this. And this is free to use models from many, there's literally tens of thousands of language models that have been contributed by users on this platform called Hugging Face. And in this example, let's say a very large pre-trained Spanish language model could be fine-tuned to reflect a particular genre or book or poet or something like that. So in terms of NLP, these are the resources that I've used quite recently in my teaching. And again, I've put them in the chat for Ugo to share with people.
We are going to share that information for sure. Okay. Steven, one last question from Claudia. Oh, you have it on the chat, so I'm going to read it in Spanish and you have it there in English. Gracias, Steven. Yo quiero preguntarte cómo sustraes los elementos significativos de las narrativas de los diversos escritores para volver sus textos imágenes familiares a los espectadores.
Thank you for the question, Claudia. This has been my position regarding your question has evolved over time. When I first started using these systems, I thought it was like magic, right? That all the outputs was amazing, and I kept everything that these AI systems said. But my position has evolved over time to where I see this as a way of better understanding my relationships with the source texts. So when I choose an author or a novel to train a system on, it's very important that I know that author's work very well. I've read all of their work. I understand some of the patterns and language that they use. And in doing so as a reader of their original work, their analog texts, I think I'm a better reader of the digital texts that come out of the AI system as well. I can start to identify when it is indeed emulating the style or the prose or the vocabulary of that author. So, you know, this is how I start to, again, read the output and make decisions about what to keep. One strategy is to ask GPT-2 to write 5 stories for me. And then I select the one that resonates the most with my story or my script or what I'm thinking about at that particular time. And this is a way that I become a kind of curator or a reader of the AI generated text. And that's the position I take with these. So I hope that answers your question. And I really appreciate the time that you've taken to listen and ask these wonderful questions. I think you're muted, Ugo. I'm missing you here.
Yes, I'm muted, sorry. We have another question here on the Facebook, but I want to know if you have time to fill it. Otherwise, we can continue these kind of conversations in the future in an online situation.
Yeah, I encourage you can share my email, please, Ugo.
Yes, let's do that.
I could answer one more question. That would be
Okay.
It might be a little bit brief in my response, but I'd be happy to.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, maybe the next answers are going to be answered very briefly, because the agreement with Timon is that he has to finish 6 sharp for other duties that he has to accomplish. So it's asking, this person is asking that we are in the state in which computer has not anymore been a tool for the artist and is starting to take decisions, aesthetic decisions. Do you consider that as a fact?
I understand that's potential, and I do have a number of opinions about it. This is why I do take the position of co-authorship with these systems. That I think some artists will state that their development of a system, their engineering, their coding of a system allows them the confidence that anything the algorithm creates will be, what they're looking for. They want that sort of to be able to give the decision making to the algorithm after they have authored the program. And I understand that position. I just happen to take a different position where I want to intervene. I want to assess the quality of the outputs and almost retranslate that into my work. I may, come to the point where, none of the output from these systems make it into my work, but they just give me ideas, sort of like provocations of what I might make in the future. So I do personally take the position where I want to be present in the aesthetic decisions of the artwork. But I think that there's a spectrum that we're encountering now where maybe more control can be given up at certain points of the process, or maybe we want to re-engage that control at certain points as well. So I encourage you as thinkers and artists to sort of take a position along that spectrum and decide what's most provocative in your work.
Yes. Timon, well, one more time, in the name of the university, we want to thank you for your time, for your presentation, for all these ideas that for sure are going to nurture all our students and all our community. We have several professors that are working also on AI and aesthetics and art. So I think this is a conversation that should last, and then maybe we should start to think in a way for doing some kind of integration, collaboration, sharing of ideas between the institutions. So thank you, Annabelle, for the translation, real-time translation. And Timon, again, thank you from the profound and deep side of our hearts. Thank you for your conversation.
I really appreciate the organizing this, and I we should develop projects in the future. So I hope to see you again.
Thank you very much, Steven.
Okay, I will go, but thank you again all. Don't hesitate to be in touch at the email that I've given to the chats and to Ugo.
Absolutely.
Okay, bye.
See you everybody. Gracias a todos. No olviden la siguiente sesión el viernes a las 10 para el cierre de este seminario. Y bueno, pues si Tibon ya se fue, a lo mejor tenemos un segundito para invitar a todas las personas a que entren a la página de arqueologiademedios.lat, en donde encontrarán el horario y la última presentación del domingo a las 10. Y bueno,
Viernes, Hugo.
digo viernes, viernes, una disculpa, viernes. ¿Sale? Es que trabajamos todos los días de la semana. Entonces, pues mucho cariño a todos y gracias. Y creo que con esto terminamos, ¿cierto, Clau?
Sí, así es, Hugo. Muchísimas gracias a todos, a todas.
Vaya a todos.
Bye.
Corriendo.
Oh, bye bye.